Look, bonjour. Thank you for having me. Yes, it's been an interesting day. I got here 7.5 minutes ago. So why are clouds not interesting? Why would I even start with a title like that at an event called Future Clouds? I actually don't think that clouds aren't interesting, just to put the double negative in there. The reason I've said clouds are not interesting is because I think the word is being horribly abused these days. And I think some clouds are still interesting, but just because someone says something is a cloud doesn't make it interesting. So my talk is really not about why clouds are not interesting. It's about why global, public, elastic clouds are interesting. These are the ones where all the interesting problems still are. There are some other cloud-related problems that are fun as well, but the hardest problems are in this particular kind of cloud, the things I think are real clouds. So I'm going to start by just quickly setting the scene by talking about the cloud I know best, which is Google's cloud. So I'll set the scene, and then I'm going to dive into one particular topic for a while, which is security in clouds, and then I'm going to talk a little more generally about where I think some of the interesting problems are, why they're worth tackling. So this is Google's cloud. It's made up of data centers scattered around the world. Not as many as people think. Barely enough for the load. This is not quite the complete set. These are the ones we completely own and operate, where we own the land as well. There's a couple of others. And this is what a cloud looks like. I hope everyone here has seen at least one picture of a cloud in their time. This is from the roof of our data center in Belgium. That's the one in Finland, in Hamina. It's an old paper mill. And this is the inside of a cloud. It's a data center. It's not quite a normal data center because it's really, really regular. Very homogeneous. And because everything looks pretty and looks like that, we have to show you what a tape library looks like as well. That's the backup for the cloud. All right, so what is a cloud? When people say cloud, do they just mean, well, it's all about operational expenses, not capital expenditure? That's one way that people define clouds. You don't have to invest up front in the full capital. I don't think that's a very good definition, to be honest. It's just, that definition is just another way of outsourcing. It's just another kind of off-site computing. This isn't new. People have been doing this for 50 years. How many people here are old enough to have heard of Multics? There's a few of us. Some of the young ones have done their history lessons as well. Multics, one of the things they tried to do was have a computer for the whole of Boston that everyone would be able to dial into. Well, remember that chart I showed you? We've got 4 computers for the whole of Europe. They weren't that wrong with their idea of how computing could be. Right? So doing your computing off-site doesn't mean it's special and new and wonderful. It doesn't mean it has to have this label. There are 3 things, I think, that make something a cloud, something special. The first of them is elasticity. You can scale up and down at will if you're doing cloud computing. You can adjust the amount of resource you're paying for that you're using to suit the task at hand. The second feature that makes something a cloud is elasticity. But there is a third feature as well. And that also is elasticity. This is what makes clouds different from other forms of outsourced computing. Now, not everybody will agree with me. This doesn't cover everything that is normally labeled as a cloud, but it makes it more interesting if we focus in on the elastic clouds, because that makes the problem solving just that little bit trickier. And that's what makes it interesting for researchers and as opportunities for doing new work in industry and in business as well. And in the future, clouds are still going to be around. They might get relabeled as something else. There's a push to just say cloud computing is internet computing. I think there's a good argument for that, or is elastic internet computing. Clouds are going to keep getting bigger, and we'll look later at the scale of clouds. And that's going to create new problems. When you build a system for a certain scale point, That same system will probably work for one order of magnitude bigger. If you're lucky, maybe two. But you'll have to rebuild it when it gets to 3 orders of magnitude bigger. And we're still growing the clouds hugely. The connectivity will get better. The capabilities, the sorts of features you have in the cloud computing will get better as well. And it's important, although I'm going to completely focus on these global public elastic clouds, they are only one part of the ecosystem for internet computing. And we do need that whole heterogeneity, that whole spectrum of provision. There is a place for small clouds and medium-sized clouds. There is a place for community clouds. I will say now, I do not believe there is such a thing as a private cloud. One of my colleagues refers to them as Yeti clouds, because no one's ever seen one that's really there. Right? Most private clouds are just someone selling you an outsourced data center at a higher price than before. One of the reasons why the interest in clouds are these global public elastic ones is because the reason cloud computing works is because you can get economies of scale and you can get efficiencies. And to get those, you need to be able to consolidate your load. You put your machines to work all the time. And this is where the global part gets interesting, because it's much easier to load a system up if you're servicing people in all 24 hours worth of time zones, so that some people are asleep, not putting load onto the systems, while others are awake and at work. And it helps if it's genuinely global, because then you're including people whose weekend is Friday and Saturday, not Saturday and Sunday. And it helps if you're not just servicing businesses, but consumers as well, because they have different patterns. Right? When people are at work, they tend to be doing work-related computing. And when they're not at work at the weekends, they're doing whatever they're doing, surfing the internet, watching YouTube videos. It's amazing how much time people spend watching cats fall into toilets. But apparently they like it. All right, so you can build a cloud. Cloud consists of a huge number of computers piled up in a warehouse somewhere. Easy enough. What are we going to do with it? Well, we do lots of things with our cloud. Just out of interest, is there anyone here who has never done a search on Google? I have actually had someone put their hand up once when I asked that question. More seriously, how many people here have used Gmail? Okay, so that means at least 2 of the services. How many people have watched a cat fall in a toilet on YouTube? A few, right? Right. So that's one cloud. There are actually different sorts of clouds. You hopefully all know this. There's the sort of cloud where you're essentially renting raw resources. Amazon's AWS is the poster child for this kind of cloud. Infrastructure as a service is essentially not much more than a thin veneer on top of metal. You're responsible for an awful lot. You're responsible for choosing your operating system, for patching it, for sorting out security things, and so on. And you get increasing levels of provision beyond that, where more and more of the work is done for you or pre-provisioned for you, to the point where you get something that can be considered platform as a service, where you really are just dumping executables into an environment and they can be run for you. Or you can go all the way up to the top end with software as a service, where you're just using a facility somebody else wrote, Gmail or whatever. And there are lots and lots of other AASs coming along: security as a service, management as a service, network as a service. Whatever you can get money out of people for as a service is going to arrive next year at the rate we're going. Right. Some of these raise different questions. Some of them don't. Some questions are just ubiquitous to the cloud. A lot of the non-technical questions, the legal questions, the policy issues, apply whichever kind of cloud you're thinking about, but not all of them. Some of them apply more to one setting than another. Data protection questions arise more in the context of software as a service than they do of infrastructure as a service, usually, not always. So we have different sorts of cloud, different kinds of problems that arise. But the general model is always the same. You have some sort of access mechanisms, things that allow you to get through the internet to your cloud. And in many situations, particularly software as a service, it's pretty straightforward. You just have some random device, some sort of web browser usually, and then you talk to things that are in the cloud. And that might equally apply for the control interfaces for your infrastructure as a service. You may be provisioning and deprovisioning through this same sort of setup. It's all really just classic computer science of let's add another layer of indirection and pretend that it's all got simpler again. All right, so we have global public clouds made up of piles of machines in warehouses in places where the electricity is cheap and the cooling is available. And lots of people sharing them so that you can pile the load on and balance that load around the turn of the day, turn of the week, turn of the year, and so on. We're already in trouble. It's already starting to get complicated. Because we're putting lots of people's things together. And we're asking people to entrust their data to an external provision. Now, this isn't a cloud-specific problem. Any sort of outsourcing suffers from this. When you use a bank account, you are entrusting your money to that bank and you're hoping that they didn't buy too many collateralized debt obligations in 2008 that haven't yet surfaced as a problem and bankrupted your bank, whatever it might be. It's always about trust. But trust becomes a big thing in certain kinds of cloud computing. So if you're thinking of what's the next generation of the cloud going to look like, you need to start by thinking, well, what are people doing with whatever it is? What are the problems that are being solved? To what extent are you reliant on people using some new facility? How much trust do they have to have in you to do it? So one of the things that's important for Google, given the nature of our business, is this issue of data stewardship. We have hundreds of millions of people using our apps, things like Gmail, Docs, and Calendar, and so on. Billions using search. There are millions of businesses completely dependent on that cloud functioning, including one that I particularly care about, which is Google, because Google lives in the same cloud as everybody else. There's a huge amount of load put on that system. And that load involves data, and that data is precious to someone. So if you're going to do cloud computing, real cloud computing, the sort where you're having to have lots of users and lots of customers, you have to start thinking about the fact that people are going to depend on you. You've got to think about what does that mean for you as a business or as a researcher. You know, if you build a new facility that people are going to use, you have to be sure it's going to work for them. It's not going to cause them problems. And one of the ways that we articulate this is through these 5 statements. These are our privacy principles. The most important one, I think, is the last one. It's about responsible stewardship. And that's the one that leads into the discussion of security. When I was an academic, I did not work on computer security. I didn't do it when I was a PhD student, I didn't do it as a postdoc, and I didn't do it as an academic. Because it seemed to me that everyone I knew who worked on computer security had become completely paranoid. And this was not a good state of mind, and I didn't want to gain that state of mind. What I've realized, what we've all realized over the last year with Snowden Snowden revelations, is that they were right to be paranoid. And it is important, if people are trusting their work, trusting their private materials to you, that you take this seriously. So even if you don't think what you're doing has any security implications, I'd like you to go away and think about this afterwards. Because the security problems are there in all forms of computing. I actually don't believe that cloud computing introduces new sorts of security problem. I think it just really brings them to the fore. It makes them very, very clear. And whereas you can sometimes get away with not doing security properly, if you're not connected to the internet, if you're the only person using the computer, you can't do that once you move into real cloud computing. So a natural reaction when people think, oh my God, we've got to keep it secure, is to lock everything down, shut everyone out, switch everything off. It doesn't work very well, unfortunately. The reason cloud computing exists in its software as a service form is because people hate working with lockdown systems. These are old numbers. But people using computers at work turn out to not quite get all their work done during the day. So they think, I'll just take something home and finish it over the weekend. So they end up taking corporate data and putting it onto data sticks and taking it home, plugging it into their machine at home. Or they take the laptop home, but on the way home, they stop off in a bar for a quick drink and they forget the laptop. There's a particularly famous incident of that in the UK when someone from the British Security Service managed to do it. It's not good to have people carrying your company data around in an insecure or an easily lost form. Huge fractions of USB sticks get lost, right? Lots of laptops get stolen. These numbers have probably gone up, right? So in practice, if you're doing any sort of computing, you need to make sure it's going to be available to people, that you're not forcing them to do their work in one place. There are a few exceptions to that. Air traffic controllers should be sitting at their desk in the air traffic control tower when they're waving the planes around in the air. The guy running the nuclear power station should be in the reactor center control room when he's turning things on and off, not doing it from his Xbox whilst watching television. Right? There are a few systems that you really do want properly locked down. But for most kinds of work, actually, people get on better if they get some flexibility. And if we can get the security right, then cloud computing can give them that because it gives them ubiquitous access to things. So imagine for a moment what it would be like if we could start again. If you could build the whole of the infrastructure from scratch, thinking about solving global problems for huge user bases, because if you're a researcher, these are hard problems, and if you're thinking about a startup, then this is the way to get lots of users, right? Either way, you want lots of usage, right? What would it look like? Well, some of the cloud systems, we've been able to do this to at least partial extent. So how do you do security from the ground up? Cloud security is just internet security. So you need to start by thinking about how are people getting access to the facility. You need some sort of access points for them, whether it's a laptop or a Chromebook or a Pixel, as we've got here, or some sort of mobile phone. They've got some entry point, and that has to be reasonably robust. Don't want it to be too easy for that to get broken into. And then whatever software they're using on these devices to access the internet, to access through to the clouds, that needs to be correct. And it's not going to be. It's going to have bugs in it. So what do we do about that? You don't let people use old versions that are known to be buggy. So you make your software auto-update. It's an interesting problem in software engineering in its own right, how to do that, but it's bringing together all these different bits of computer science is what's going to allow us to solve these security problems. So you have auto-updating software on these reasonably simple, reasonably well-checked devices to give people access. Then you make sure that their connections are as secure as possible. And it's become clear we have to work even harder at this than we thought we did. Thank you, various national governments. And no, the French government isn't accepted from this. All of them are as bad as each other. So you do things like certificate pinning. What's certificate pinning? That's making sure the browser knows what the certificate should look like for the service it's supposed to be accessing. How many people here have heard of DigiNotar? A couple. DigiNotar used to be a certificate authority in the Netherlands, and they got hacked, and they didn't tell people they'd been hacked. And rather a lot of certificates were minted with their name on it, including one for my employer, and it looked like it was a valid certificate. Fortunately, Chrome knew what a Google.com certificate should look like. So the Iranian users who were being given the wrong certificate saw warnings pop up saying, this certificate looks valid, but it isn't. You should tell somebody. And eventually somebody did, and we found out what happened. The Dutch government were really unimpressed because DigiNotar had also issued the certificates for the online tax system for the Netherlands. As I said, DigiNotar no longer exists as a company. There are other things you can do. Lots and lots of little things. Make sure the certificates are checkable. Make sure that DNS is harder to break because it's a bit ropey as a system. So we run our own that anyone can use if they want to. Make sure that you don't just use SSL, but you use it well. Perfect forward secrecy is a wonderful little thing that just makes it that bit harder for someone. So if they record all of the activity, they can't wait 30 years till the computers get better and then try and break the crypto, because you don't get to see the keys to record them to break them later. All of you who use Gmail, put your hands up again, please. Keep your hand up if you have enabled second factor authentication. So thank you to those who have. All of you who haven't, you are irresponsible and a danger to everyone who kept their hands up. Your accounts are much harder to hack if it requires a second factor. So it's not enough for someone to know your password. They also have to have access to a device in your possession that is generating numbers according to a particular random sequence. There's all sorts of little things which piled layer upon layer upon layer make the internet more secure. There's a lovely one that's very nearly here. It's a thing called certificate transparency, in which the certificate authorities basically will publish every certificate that they produce. So when you generate a certificate for Google.com, you put it into a log. And that means that they can be looked up and checked. Now, it doesn't mean someone can, it does make it impossible to forge certificates, but it means the forgeries won't work for very long. It just makes it that little bit more robust again. There are lots and lots of these little tricks. And this is just focused on the connection between those users and the data centers. It's just one piece of the security story with layer upon layer having to go into it. All computing is complicated. It turns out that getting things secure is even more so. We do other things. We protect people from malicious content. So you do lots of malware scanning and so on, and we share that. We do physical security. It's always interesting when people say, oh, I'm not sure about using these clouds because I don't know what's going to happen about them getting my data. Right? And people always start worrying about where the data is. Worrying about where the data is the wrong question. Where the data is only interesting if you're worried about a physical attack. So what you need to know about where the data is it inside a locked room or not? How easy is it for someone to steal the keys? Data is much more vulnerable to electronic attack than it is to physical attack. But you secure your physical stuff anyway. So Google went one step extra in securing the data. So we have biometrics on the doors to the data center floor just to check who's going in. We have both humans and computers watching the infrared feeds and the video feeds and so on for things that are unusual. In one of our data centers, and I have to admit this was by accident, not by design, we ended up with an alligator as an extra layer of defense. The cooling ponds in one of our US data centers had a problem with algae buildup, so someone put fish into the ponds to eat the algae, and an alligator moved in from a nearby river. So we have one data center that has an alligator defense as well. Don't think that would work so well in Finland. But you secure the data physically, you secure it electronically, and so on. And part of looking after data is making sure that it's properly encrypted. And this slide got mangled in transition, I'm afraid. So you encrypt the data at rest, you encrypt it in transit, you encrypt it even when you're moving it between one set of your machines and another, because some swine worked out how to tap the internet faster than we thought they'd be able to. It's believed that the German security service taught the British security service how to do this, who then taught the French. So the French do know. They managed to tap major internet cables at full line speed and get a 30-day buffer. That's seriously impressive engineering. Thank you very much, GCHQ. I'm not impressed. You just made my life harder. Anyway. So you look after the data when it's moving around. And when data is finished with, when copies are being destroyed, you do that properly. So this, it's a bit dark, so I'm not sure if you can make out what's happening here. These are disk drives. In a Google data center, if a disk drive becomes unusable for any reason, it is electromagnetically wiped repeatedly in all the official standard ways. And then once we're pretty sure there's no data there, then just to make sure, we crush it. That's a pile driver basically distorting the plates by pumping through it. But that's not good enough, so having done that, then you shred it. So you end up with tiny fragments coming out, and then you send those fragments off for recycling as raw materials, because we're a green company and we don't believe in waste. And it's much better to melt the stuff just to be on the safe side. So you look after the data. Now you might think, well, yes, but my business idea is going to be an app to help people send the word yo to their friend. It's a famous app at the moment. Do I really need to worry about this? Well, actually, yes, you do. Because you know that A knows B. And that's not necessarily public information. You should do your security properly no matter what. So you do your encryption for everybody, even if it seems like overkill. If you start off doing encryption properly, you don't have to worry about it later. Right? And you make sure you're doing the right kind of encryption, and it turns out that not all encryption works well. We recently deployed an entirely new cipher suite because we were a bit worried that some of the existing ones may have been compromised. Thanks again, NSA. You always have to work at this and push the boundaries and so on. Now, it depends exactly what kind of computing you're doing, how seriously you take this, but you don't ignore it. Because the interesting thing about real cloud computing is you get these glorious economies of scale. So Google's cloud, the thing I showed you pictures of earlier, each lump of that cloud, I'm not quite sure what the unit of a cloud should be, each data center, is made up of tens of thousands or more, I'm not allowed to tell you how many, tens of thousands of essentially identical machines. Machines built to our spec, so they don't have unnecessary parts in them. Machines that are the same as each other, so they're easily replaced. Right? Machines that have a stripped down, hardened operating system in them to try and reduce the attack surface. And because of that heterogeneity, you can do rolling upgrades. So we take data centers offline and bring them back online, having swept through and updated all the OS images whenever we feel the need. And one of the glories of building clouds the way we do, we got lucky, right? They're built out of really cheap parts. We have commodity parts, huge numbers of them. Keeps the price down, because remember, almost all Google services are given away essentially for free. So that means we can't afford to spend a lot on providing those services. So you build out of cheap parts, but that means things are going to fail. But it turned out they were going to fail anyway at this scale. If you knew how to build a machine that had a 30-year mean time between failures, which nobody knows how to do. Well, maybe the people that build interplanetary probes know how, but the rest of us don't know how, right? You build a machine with 30 years between failures, put 10,000 of them in a room, and one's going to fail every day. Actually, it's worse than that. A whole load fail on the first day. It dies off a bit, but they never stop failing. So you have to build your systems on the assumption that things will randomly fail, which means your software can cope when a machine suddenly stops, which means that you can do upgrades by just knocking some of the machines over, upgrading the operating system and restarting them, because the layers above will restart automatically. That's the beauty of global scale cloud computing. You suddenly get these really hard problems to solve that make other problems go away. And this scale issue, these economies of scale, means that you can kind of do replication of data for free. And by the way, if anyone is thinking of setting up a business offering some sort of backup service, please make sure you understand the difference between a mirror and a backup. There's a case of this recently, but I'll tell you about one we had. Gmail, remember all of you who use Gmail? Gmail keeps multiple copies of your mail. That way, if something goes wrong with one copy or with the data center that copy is in, we've still got access to another copy for you. A couple of years ago, there was a bug that managed to wipe out all copies of the data for a particular set of users really quickly. Fortunately, we noticed what it was doing before it had rolled out and was affecting all users, but it still took out quite a few people. Those multiple copies are essentially mirrors. But because they're online, and it's essentially the same software suite, they're vulnerable to replication bugs. Fortunately, Gmail has backups, and that was the day we had to tell the world we do use tape. because we had offline copies, and people were really careful about bringing that data back. We waited till we were sure we'd fix the bug. But it's important to understand, if you're building large-scale systems, it's not good enough to keep 2 copies or 3 copies of the data, even in different continents. You might think that's going to protect you from huge brownouts of electricity supplies, terrible weather, people with an anchor dragging all the internet cables out of the bottom of the ocean. But it won't necessarily protect you against bugs. So you keep copies of data offline as well as online. And by the way, if you are building a service, never guarantee to delete people's data when they ask you to. How many of you think you should, just naively? If a user says, I want you to delete my data, how many people here think you should do so straight away? Okay? You just destroyed every business that accidentally gets hacked or has a malicious employee. Because if you delete the data the moment you're told to, there's no chance to recover if it turned out that instruction came from someone who shouldn't have issued it, either by accident or by design. So you should always build some hysteresis in. And this is why you'll find with the big cloud systems where they're providing backup services, they always say things like, we will delete your data when you tell us to, but it will take some number of months. And the reason it's some number of months is because there's a layer upon layer of protection to stop the data being deleted. And also that allows plenty of time to deal with the fact that the guy who you employed as a sysadmin turns out to be a psychopath who hates you and who's been systematically destroying your company for the 2 months before he leaves. There's still a chance we might be able to bring you back. There's all sorts of interesting problems that come when you're working at scale. But the best advantage of all of the economy of scale is this last one. If you have good security people working on a big cloud or sharing their knowledge from vendor to vendor to vendor, which is what happens, then everyone benefits from their work. It's not just one small group of users that benefit from it. And most of the security problems need to be tackled at quite a low level, so that helps. Remember what I said about multi-tenancy? Everyone's using the same cloud. Google's data is in the same cloud that millions of businesses are using, that hundreds of millions of consumers are using. Well, that makes life interesting, but it's not actually different from what you should do if you're building a system just for one company, because you should still have separation between the different parts. If your payroll system gets a bug, you don't want it to take out your customer relationship management system. You should still have isolation between them. So all of these systems, all clouds, should be built using some sort of sandboxes or VMs or whatever, with lots of layers of isolation, lots of separation of concerns going on. And you build in things like denial of service defenses as well, good ones if you're big enough. And then, because none of us know how to write perfect software, if you become big enough as a company, you do this. And if you're an academic interested in security issues, you point your students at these competitions. Right? You basically say to the world, we will give you money if you can break these systems, providing you tell us how you did it. And then they have an incentive to tell you rather than selling it to some other person who'll abuse it. So there's lots of examples of this sort of thing go on. And then you keep testing your systems as well. You keep trying to break them. We have a lovely thing. We didn't used to talk about it 2 years ago. We finally had a paper published about it. At least once a year, we try and break our systems while you're still using them. A team of people will do things like turn off a data center, disable a transoceanic cable, introduce a particular kind of bug into a particular system, announce that a whole suite of employees have just been kidnapped by aliens. We actually did that once. Take out all access to people above a certain grade in the company and see if the company can keep going. Makes for interesting tests. You have to do this if people are relying on you. And if you are successful in business, or if you are building interesting technology that's going to get used as an academic, people are going to rely on you. It's worth thinking about this. And if you're a software engineering researcher, it's even more interesting to think about this, because you can build this into the methodologies you develop. But at the end of the day, there is no such thing as perfect security. We all just do the best we can. Okay. So, Clouds are interesting because they're big and hard and tricky and there's hard problems, but there are benefits if people use them because it makes things much cheaper and much easier for the end user if the systems builders have done it right. But you also have to worry about safeguarding the user's interests, making sure that users do feel that they can trust these systems. So this is a couple of things that many companies now do. These are ours. This is a transparency report. It's informing your user base what's going on with law enforcement. You can't naively say, we will never respond to any law enforcement request. No one's ever going to be allowed your data, because one day a policeman you trust will turn up with a warrant saying, somebody has kidnapped a child and we have reason to believe it's this user of yours and we want to see what's in their email in case they've been plotting something with a friend or whatever it might be. So you're going to have to think about how to handle that. And we do handle that, and then we tell people how often we get asked for that sort of thing. And then these guys I love. If you've never heard of the Data Liberation Front, look them up in the world's second best search engine, which is YouTube. They have some great little videos. They started out thinking that they were going to be a rebellious force inside the company, and they're now poster childs for the company instead. It's not quite what they intended. Their role is to make it trivially easy to remove your data from Google and stop using Google services. And the reason for that is that if they do their job well, it means everyone else in the company has to do their jobs even better so that the users don't want to. And you should do that. If you're going to build a business, think really hard about this. Don't think about how to lock your users in, because they won't like that. Think about how to make it so they don't have to use your systems, but they want to. You'll get far more users that way. It's a nice philosophy. It's a very constructive philosophy. All right. So this is what clouds look like today. This is some of the security mechanisms and so on. What's the future going to hold? I'm not allowed to make forward-looking statements. Google I/O starts on Wednesday, right? It's a day and a half from now, and I'm not even allowed to tell you what's going to be announced there. But fortunately, we already run some forward-looking projects, so I can tell you about them and the problems that they're obviously going to generate in the future. So let's start with the obvious one, the Internet of Things. Everyone's hopefully heard of the Internet of Things. That's an internet-connected thermostat from Nest. I'm sure if it hasn't already happened, sometime soon someone's going to start talking about the cloud of things instead of the Internet of Things. This is a bad use of the word cloud. And of course, things can be wearable, so it all starts to get folded into it. What gets interesting is when you get to things like the one in the middle. Anyone think they recognize that? That's a contact lens that includes a glucose measure and a transmitter. You wear that and it will track the level of glucose in your tears, which is closely correlated to the blood glucose level. So this can tell you every 2 minutes approximately what your blood glucose is. So if you're diabetic or at risk of becoming diabetic, this can talk to a smartphone. No need to implant anything in you, no need to keep taking blood. This is an ongoing project at the moment. It started in an academic research lab with Microsoft funding. It's currently going on at Google X with Google funding. It's a long, slow thing, but they're doing some preliminary trials. Right? The real push to the Internet of Things is going to go much further than most of us imagine, and this is where it gets interesting. Okay? So it's not really a cloud, it's just anything that's connected to some sort of Wi-Fi or wired device. So it's the Internet of Things is the right name for it. Let's not play silly games with it. But it will go further than you think, further than I think, and that will raise interesting problems. Here's another one, a more challenging one, but more famous one. This is a self-driving car. This is what the world looks like to a self-driving car. You can perhaps see the car in the middle. There are some trees. There are a few pedestrians at the junction and so on. Lots of nice videos of self-driving cars. Self-driving cars are not new. They're not a Google-specific thing. This, by the way, is the latest version of the Google self-driving car. It looks a little silly. It has a few interesting features. It has a maximum speed of 25 miles an hour, because that allows them to do all sorts of interesting things that you're not supposed to do with normal cars. And it has no steering wheel. It has no brake or accelerator. So this idea that, well, you have a self-driving car, but if things get difficult, a human being will take over. No, they won't. They'll be asleep or reading the newspaper or talking to the person sitting next to them. They're not going to be paying attention. It turns out it's a bit risky to rely on a human to save you in the event of an emergency. So you build the self-driving car so that it's safer even in an emergency. And that's what this generation of the cars are going to be for. But almost all the car manufacturers are working in this space to some degree or other. The German manufacturers started many, many years ago. This is some material from Mercedes-Benz. You can go on and make the problems harder. When your founders are multi-billionaires who don't need to worry about where the next penny comes from, and who have this large pool of engineers available to them, they can just say, go and do this. And the stockholders don't get much say in the matter because the two billionaires that own the place have more than half the votes. They can do whatever they like, basically. And this is a nice experiment. How many people have heard of Project Loon? Good, right. These are the balloons for Project Loon. That's them flying over somewhere in New Zealand. This is an attempt to give internet to the whole world, rural areas. I believe they got in excess of 20 megabit per second upload in some recent trials. These are balloons that float at 20 kilometers. That's twice the height of an aircraft. You don't just do things with balloons. We just bought a company that makes drones that are solar powered and can stay in the air for years. That's another way of getting internet in to an area. You just put the transmitter on there and that thing just floats around. The balloons are great, but they're not very good at steering themselves. The only thing they can do is go up and down, so they have to rely on crosswinds in the stratosphere to reposition themselves. A drone can actually fly about. We like things that fly, so we just bought a satellite company as well. That's actually a mapping satellite, so I'm cheating a bit, but it could equally well be something used for communication to get internet more widely. And just for the full set of all the flying things. Anyone know what this is? Looks like it has 4 propellers to make it fly, but it doesn't. It's a kite. It is put up into the wind on a tether. Those are wind turbines. And the advantage of this is you don't have to build a huge great pole to stand it on. You just float it up, and if it gets too windy, you can bring it back down again. Right? So that's a form of wind power generation. So that's low altitude compared with the others. But you can do strange and silly things. Now, why am I telling you about these? None of these is anything to do with cloud computing, except possibly the balloons, since they float through them. The thing is that they all raise challenges that relate to cloud computing. That first one, the Internet of Things, that brings up huge numbers of security issues. Everything needs to be properly secured because you never know how the data can be abused or taken advantage of. So even if you're making some little device that's meant to be just checking glucose levels in the eyes, you should be thinking about how we're going to secure this. And if you're building Internet of Things devices, how are you going to change the keys for the encryption if you feel the need? There's all sorts of little problems behind the scenes in the Internet of Things. Tasks like self-driving cars, those kinds of problem, require very complex data sets to be brought together and manipulated and prepared. Now, some of them are dynamic. The device just handles them himself, like the sensors on the car. But some of them require pre-computation. That's where the cloud computing comes in there. And there are hard problems in big data to be solved if we're really going to take advantage of what we can now do with cloud computing. And then that last one, if we make the internet ubiquitous, there are 7 billion people on the planet, we should be able to give all of them access. The whole point of the internet, if you think about it, is that it brings together a substantial fraction of the sum total of human knowledge and makes it available to all. Well, if we're going to do that, you have to start building systems that will work regardless of whether it's someone sitting at a huge workstation in an office somewhere with great internet connectivity in the Western world, or if it's a farmer in the middle of nowhere in Africa with a crappy old cell phone trying to find out what the price of goats is today in another country. which does now happen and has improved the lot of Sudanese goat farmers because they now know what the price of goats is in Saudi Arabia, so they don't get ripped off by the middlemen anymore. Interesting the way the world changes. But the big change, and this affects every aspect of the computing we do, is that we are moving from a world where it's all about PCs and servers to a world where it's about mobile phones and tablets and then connecting through to these remote, larger scale compute systems. Or maybe not so large scale. You never really know, but you don't need to know anymore. You just know it's out there somewhere and you can connect to it. So clouds at the moment are pretty big. They do some interesting things. If you're a systems researcher, it's important to understand how big they are. How much traffic is there? There really are more than 100 hours of cats falling into toilets being uploaded to YouTube every minute. Okay, there's a few other things as well. There are dogs on skateboards and monkeys riding pigs and a few other bits and pieces that's famous. People dancing is quite popular, right? That's actually not the interesting part of YouTube. The two interesting parts of YouTube are the content ID system, which takes those 100 hours and matches them against the reference sets for all the copyright material that's been handed in to see if any of it is a rip-off of the copyright material. That's an interestingly hard problem. It's kind of solved, but it could be improved upon. Or for systems people, all those users watching all those videos, that's an awful lot of video streams to start and stop over and over again. That makes for some nice networking problems. Search, if you're interested in things like semantic web or data structures, get your scale right. It's not interesting unless there's at least 1 trillion of something happening. And 1 trillion is interesting because 1 in 1 million things happen lots of times, and you'll get 2 occurrences of independent 1 in 1 million problems at the same time if you do 1 trillion things. All right, I'm cheating on the probability, but you get the idea. And the cloud itself, which is what we're really talking about, how big are clouds? Right now, in Google's cloud, every week we start up in excess of 2 billion container instances. That's essentially starting a new program, a new image of some sort. The data store is serving more than 6 trillion operations every month. So if you're trying to solve problems of scaling and you're thinking, oh, I wonder if it would work at that scale, you're already behind the curve. As an academic, you're trying to solve problems 5 to 10 years out. So you need to move on from these numbers. If you're in industry, if you're trying to start a business, you don't need to worry about this initially, but if you're successful, you better know someone who can help you build the underlying infrastructure to cope. And you can do all sorts of other things. I won't go into all the detail there. So what are the clouds going to look like? What's the scale you have to think about? Well, we don't know, but you can extrapolate. They're just going to keep on doubling. And we keep piling up more and more machines. We keep building better and better networks. There's going to be more and more traffic. That's fine, because that's what makes research interesting. That's what makes engineering interesting, is that the problems get bigger and harder. But my plea is that that's what we focus on. That we don't get sucked into the wrong definition of cloud, where it's just a label to try and make people hand over money, where we really are looking at the hard problems, the global scale problems, the problems of multi-tenancy, the problems of elasticity. If things suddenly get bigger and then smaller again, can you cope? Those are interesting, hard problems, and there are lots of them. I focused on security, but over the course of the day and a half, you can hear about lots of different areas where these same sorts of problems arise. And that's why I think cloud computing, the real cloud computing, actually is interesting. And I'll stop there. We have 8 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Peter. Any question from the audience?
Hybrids are miraculously missing from your future view, and I'm curious if that's sort of a reasoned approach or a Google positioning.
Hybrid clouds. I actually do believe in hybrid clouds. No, it's just I was limited for time. I couldn't put everything in. No, you have to have some in-house provision, even if it's just thin clients. The moment you do that, you're going to end up with some other stuff as well, and you start ending up with an interesting mixture of what you want where. If you can solve the public cloud problem, and you really understand the system architectures and so on, then I believe you probably can solve the hybrid cloud problems as well. If you can't solve hybrid cloud problems, then we also can't solve federated cloud problems, and chances are we will be able to do that. So I think the hybrid clouds will get solved. But there are interesting challenges in API design, in building systems that have hugely disparate latency, depending on whether you're working locally or remotely and things like that. There's some really nice systems problems to solve there.
Hi. So stronger security means handing out more and more personal information about the individuals. For example, the point that you just made about the two-step authentication, so you're basically giving out your mobile phone number so that Google can actually track the mobile phone numbers across different Google services, for example. So how do you address this issue of more and more personal information have to be given out for getting potentially stronger security?
So there's a slight error in the underlying assumption, though I do see where you're coming from. Second factors don't have to be done by telling Google what your mobile phone number is. That happens to be the implementation we have at the moment, because we start off with a simple version where you tell us a mobile phone and we'll send you a text message with your code number in it. You can move from there to having an authenticator app, right? Most of the phones now are running Android. If we really wanted to know where you were that badly, we could hack Android. We don't, right? You choose whether to tell us or not. You can turn on location tracking, you turn it off again. There is an interesting problem there. There are other ways of doing second factor, and more will become available, but they're harder for people to use, like having a freestanding token, a device that you buy separately. And you can buy that for cash and no one knows that you've got it, and then you start that off as the seed number to get your second factor going and so on. For a while, that's how we did things internally. The trouble is it's not very usable. So the trade-off is not, do I have to hand over more data in order to get this security? It's what's the most usable thing we can come up with. I mean, the giving mobile numbers to Google does worry people for all sorts of reasons. One of the reasons I've heard is people are worried that we'll start sending them marketing messages or adverts in text. That's a misunderstanding of the business model. And a lot of the security fears relate to this as well. I could spend 20 minutes talking about that, so I might deal with it afterwards. But the thing to realize is that if it's an advertising-based business like Google, then we're acting as a middleman. And if we piss off our customers, we make no money. So if we abuse the role we're in, it gets very difficult for us as a company. No one is required to click on ads. No one is required to give us any money. So we have to be a little bit careful to only show people ads that are useful to them, if we can manage that, not to show them too many ads, not to leak their information to the advertisers, because if we do, we lose our business model and the advertisers will go direct to them. But there is, at the heart of it, you're right, a trade-off that certain sorts of security require things to be done that the user is not able to do for themselves, and they need some help. And that may involve an interaction with a company that therefore learns something unavoidably from doing that. If you can find a way around that, that's great. As I say, the one I know of is that you could buy tokens and use those. And that is workable, but it costs people money, which it turns out they don't want to spend. And it's hard because they have to go to the shop and buy the token. Whereas just saying, what's your mobile phone number? And the problem is solved. I think that was an unsatisfactory answer, but I'll talk to you some more.
Hello? Sorry.
Last question.
Yes, there is talks about regulation from the net neutrality these days, or deregulation. Is regulation or deregulation a threat or an opportunity for Google?
Google believes very, 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 very strongly indeed in net neutrality. We always have. The danger is, I'm Google's rep to ENISA, the EU's Network and Information Security Agency. And one of the things that's interesting about that is I keep finding myself having to defend small companies. And the same thing is going to happen with net neutrality. If the net turns out not to be neutral, Google will survive. We're big enough that we can cope. You know, the cable companies won't want to disconnect their users from YouTube because the users will want to watch YouTube videos and so on. We'll find a way to survive. But it's very bad for the overall ecosystem. And it's bad for us if there's no competition. It keeps us on our toes. So as a company, we fight hard for net neutrality, even if we could probably survive without it. We just don't think it's right. So, I can't prove that to you, other than by pointing out statements the company's made and things we've done to lobby in this space. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to